Ladies and gentlemen, this is TVP World. I'm your host Benjamin Lee, and welcome aboard the Eastern Express. Now, this time around, we're talking about one of the most unexpected and humiliating military defeats of recent times. This story is a tale of an underdog and an overconfident favorite. And though it's not taken from a boxing card, it might as well happen. That's because we're talking about Ukraine's unprecedented success against Russia's Black Sea Fleet. As many have already pointed out, a country with no navy to speak of has managed to make the Russian fleet look like a collection of floating bathtubs. And when there's bathtub, there are sometimes bath bombs to match. So without further ado, here's our latest report on the issue.
All Russian Navy ships have reportedly left the base at Sevastopol. As the Bosphorus has been closed to military ships in light of the war, they have most likely relocated to the Russian naval base at Novorossiysk on the Black Sea shore. Ukraine managed to force Russia to stop using the base at Sevastopol using unconventional means. Naval drone missiles were used to target ships at sea with great success. The drones the size of a water scooter have proved to be a game changer, able to destroy major vessels.
We understand the structure of all their ships, where the first strike and the second strikes should be made, which parts of the ship are extremely important and critical for the ship's survivability. We always organize our work in such a way as to have several options for striking, not just one target.
The new technology could prove disruptive as world powers rely on increasingly larger surface combatants for its core naval missions. Ukraine also used cruise and ballistic missiles to target ships, those docked in port. Old Soviet Tochka-U missiles were used to destroy an amphibious ship in the first weeks of the war. Storm Shadow missiles destroyed a submarine in Sevastopol's dock. The most spectacular attack saw the cruiser Moskva, the Black Sea Fleet's flagship, struck using anti-ship missiles. Forcing the Russian Navy off the western part of the Black Sea has allowed for relatively safe access to Ukrainian ports for civilian vessels. Russian mine layers have also been targeted by Ukrainians, and this has forced them to reduce their operations. Some danger remains from stray mines deployed in the early days of the conflict, but this danger should be diminished as demining operations progress.
And now let's take a look at the issue in greater detail. Okay, let's get a few things straight. Russia's Black Sea Fleet isn't just some rusty relic floating around on Soviet nostalgia. This is a serious military force, complete with missile cruisers, submarines, and enough firepower to make any coastal city think twice before hosting a beach party. And yet, despite all of this, Ukraine, without a proper navy, has effectively neutered this maritime behemoth. It's like showing up to a Formula 1 race on a skateboard and lapping the field. So how did this happen? Well, the simple answer: creativity, resilience, and a little bit of asymmetrical warfare. Ukraine's military, realizing that they couldn't match Russia ship for ship, decided to hit Russia where it hurts most: its sense of invincibility. So instead of engaging in open sea battle, which would have been suicide, Ukraine has employed a series of surgical strikes. And let's not forget about drones, though not those buzzing in the sky ones. Remember the Moskva cruiser? Russia sure does, though they'd rather forget it. That was the pride of Russia's Black Sea Fleet, a missile cruiser equipped with advanced anti-aircraft systems, anti-ship missiles, and enough firepower to level a city. But all it took was a couple of well-placed Ukrainian missiles, and the Moskva was sent to the bottom of the sea, taking with it Russia's naval pride. The flagship sinking wasn't just a military loss, it was a symbolic defeat, showing that the Russian Navy isn't as untouchable as the Kremlin would like us to believe. And this wasn't an isolated incident. Ukraine has turned the entire Black Sea into a no-go zone for Russian ships. How? By turning ordinary tools into extraordinary weapons. We're talking about improvised sea mines, drones used to harass and damage larger ships, and coastal missile strikes that keep Russian vessels far from Ukrainian shores. The result has been uncanny. Russia's naval forces have had to retreat, reposition, and rethink their entire Black Sea strategy. Crimea, once the jewel of Putin's crown, has turned into a fortress under siege, with the Russian fleet hunkering down in ports rather than patrolling the sea as it once did. And all of this has made a mockery of Western fears about escalation. Remember when the West hesitated to provide Ukraine with more advanced weaponry out of fear of provoking Russia? Well, it turns out Russia don't need any provoking. They manage to humiliate themselves just fine. This retreat from the Black Sea is a strategic debacle. Russia's failure to secure the Black Sea and protect Crimea exposes the fragility of their military might. It also sends a message to the world. Ukraine isn't just defending itself, it is redefining what modern warfare looks like. While Russia was preparing for a traditional naval showdown, Ukraine was busy rewriting the rules, proving that sometimes the best defense is a creative offense. So, where does this leave Russia? Well, let's just say that when your fleet is hiding away in a port instead of projecting power, you've got problems. Putin's dream of making the Black Sea a Russian lake has turned into a nightmare, and Ukraine is the reason why. Ukraine's success has shown the world that asymmetrical warfare isn't just a strategy, it's a necessity for smaller nations facing off against larger powers. And for Russia, it's a humbling lesson in how not to underestimate your opponent, especially when that opponent is fighting for its very survival. And now, here to shed more light on the issue is Andreas Umland, analyst at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. Hello, sir, and welcome to Eastern Express.
Thanks for having me again.
So we are looking at the David versus Goliath situation as Ukraine sinking the Russians' Black Fleet, some of the boats of the Russian Black Fleet. How did that even happen? I mean, looking from like an observer's perspective, we're talking about a country that doesn't even have its own navy versus some of the, well, probably most fearsome navy in the world.
What happened simply was a technological change that enabled Ukraine to develop these naval drones with which then Ukraine was able to take out several of the ships of the Black Sea Fleet, and now basically the Sevastopol port is dysfunctional for the Russian Black Sea Navy. And I remember discussions 10 years, 20 years, 30 years ago, where the port of Sevastopol and its existential meaning for Russia was a major topic, actually, in the whole discussion about the conflict, that first diplomatic conflicts and then military conflict between Russia and Ukraine. And now suddenly this port is not any longer usable for Russia, because Ukraine had these numerous successful drone attacks and also missile attacks on Sevastopol, and now Sevastopol is basically a meaningless city in military terms for Russia.
You mentioned Sevastopol having an existential meaning for Russia. So do you think these blows were able to actually have significant impact in the course of the war, at least in a symbolic manner, impacting the morale? Does it have any substantial effect actually in the front lines?
That is difficult to say. I just remember the times when many people who were sort of arguing that Ukraine should not become a NATO member, that Ukraine should not become an EU member, that Ukraine should in fact join the Eurasian Economic Union and other alliances led by Russia, because that would be wiser. Then Sevastopol, and especially the port of Sevastopol, and the Black Sea Fleet was a major argument in this. And there was this whole theory about the allegedly high importance and for Russia of this port, and that Russia would never be able to give this port away, and because it needs it. And now suddenly the port is not any longer functional for Russia, and we are now in a different world. And this whole argument that for basically 3 decades was a major topic in debates about Ukraine's foreign policy, Russia's foreign policy, NATO enlargement, EU enlargement, Russia-NATO relations, Ukraine-Russia relations. Sevastopol was always there, and now it's become a nothing burger, basically.
Right, a different world is a very good way to look at it. And I was wondering if this kind of, let's say, the war in Ukraine actually changed the perception of how we conceived the war for so many years. Like you mentioned, this is pretty much unfathomable before it actually happened. And now we're looking at a world where things that are, well, almost in the calculation of things suddenly becoming non-existent. Do you think that this would probably prompt us to kind of reconsider how we approach war as a whole and the calculations that we make as a result of it?
I'm not a military expert, so I look at it from the political point of view. What has happened now is suddenly that, as in my perception at least, that these classical signs of military power, the ships and the size of the ships and the variety of weapons that the ships are having, they appear, at least of what we've seen now, what Ukraine has done to the Russian Black Sea Fleet, this all appears to be becoming not entirely meaningless, but it's all very relative now. And obviously, it's now changing also the whole constellation, the geopolitics of the Black Sea, I would say, because Ukraine has found a way to basically contain Russia in the Black Sea and to restore fully or almost fully the Black Sea trade, especially with grain, and without any consultation of Russia, and simply cooperating obviously with Western partners, but also creating facts on the ground with its new fleet of naval drones and also with its missiles, and thereby reshaping the geopolitics of the Black Sea region.
Right. When we discuss war in Ukraine, of course, talking about the West, there's always the fear of escalation being into the calculation. So I'm also wondering, from a political perspective, do you think that this would actually allow the West to hesitate less, seeing that, well, much more could be done without like Russia really escalating after their Black Sea Fleet taking a hit?
Yeah, we've seen many of these red lines sort of being now violated. Things that were seen as being impossible 3 years ago are now happening. The most obvious sign here is, of course, the Ukraine advance into Russian national territory, legitimate Russian land territory. But also what is happening in the Black Sea, I think, and the whole situation in which Crimea now finds itself is also something that is an embarrassment, of course, for Putin and a problem for Russia. And nevertheless, it all is still within the framework of a conventional war. And if only Ukraine had more weaponry, more advanced weaponry, a larger amount of weaponry, more technological help, I think perhaps the war would already be over.
All right, with the very limited resources, we already see what Ukraine have done. So it's really hard to imagine what could be done with even more resources on their hands. There's recent reports about possibility of Germany pulling back its support. Do you think that's a misinformation, or are they looking for any other venues instead of the national budget to fund Ukraine?
Well, Germany has found itself in a strange situation in that it has constitutional rules made for peacetime and that are still valid and have to be observed by the government, although there's the largest war in Europe happening since World War II. And what has happened is simply that now we have a budget for the next year where basically no money or very little money is left for Ukraine, inadequate amount of money. And the government cannot easily increase the size of the budget and take debt, because that is forbidden by by constitutional rules. And now Germany has to look for a solution for that. Either change perhaps its legislation or some sort of trick, basically, to to take care of that. The German argument here is, of course, that there is the German funding via the European Union also going to Ukraine. A part of this money, a large part of this money, is in fact German. And then there's the other argument about the frozen Russian assets that could replace German help for Ukraine, but that would be an argument then for every country to cut down its help for Ukraine, and the problem here being that this money is still frozen, and it's not clear how exactly one can unfreeze it and how exactly one can then replace the Western help that Ukraine is now getting with these frozen assets.
Right, but the time is of the essence here when it comes to supporting their kind of incursion into the Kursk region. And we've already seen some Russian propaganda trying to utilize that as pushing a narrative of a war fatigue. Do you think that this, action from Germany might actually push the rest of the Western world to be more hesitant in helping Ukraine in pushing into the Kursk region, or reach the peace agreement, getting the bargain chip that they need?
I hope not, because in fact, I would argue the other way around. The Kursk incursion by the Ukrainian army is in a way a sign of desperation. Obviously, the Ukrainian leadership would have preferred to invest not into an incursion into Russian national territory, but rather into liberating Ukrainian national territory from Russian occupation. But the military resources for that are insufficient. The weaponry is insufficient. The kind of weaponry that Ukraine has is insufficient in all sorts of ways. And then Ukraine is looking for sort of unconventional ways to change the situation, and is now attacking actually legitimate Russian national territory, which would have, in a different situation, never come to the minds, I guess, of the Ukrainian leadership. And if now Germany will pull out of the support, then the Ukrainian leadership will think more of unconventional ways to protect Ukraine, and maybe on its part it will make actually the situation even more dangerous and risky and unpredictable. So I think that would be a very dangerous way to think about it, that if Germany now pulls out, then the others will pull out. Well, Ukraine cannot pull out of this war. It can only, if it capitulates, this would then give way to Russian genocide of Ukrainians. So this would be actually a very bad conclusion if then other countries follow here the German example.
Right, definitely a lot of moving pieces here to take into consideration. So thank you so much for breaking down this situation for us, and thanks for being with us on Eastern Express. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me again.
And now we move on to the Eastern News Flash, a series of all this other stories from the East that you don't want to miss. The destruction of the Nord Stream pipelines has hit the news once again, following the Wall Street Journal's report alleging Ukrainian involvement. Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk commented on the attack.
The Wall Street Journal's article claiming Ukraine was behind the 2022 attacks on Nord Stream 1 and 2 has renewed discussion about the responsibility for the pipeline's destruction. Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk focused on a related issue. He criticized the construction of the pipeline in the first place, saying, quote, "To all the initiators and patrons of Nord Stream 1 and 2, the only thing you should do today about it is apologize and keep quiet." Nord Stream 1 used to transport natural gas from Russia to Germany, with the second pipeline intended to do the same, but was never completed. The projects were criticized by Poland and other Eastern European countries, which feared reliance on Russian gas might be used to influence Germany's foreign policy. The pipeline's destruction denied Moscow leverage on Berlin.
Serbia is seeing protests against the opening of a major lithium mine. The Serbian government has accused Western countries of orchestrating the demonstrations.
Serbian President Aleksandar Vučić accused the protesters opposing the establishment of the lithium mine of being part of a hybrid warfare waged by Western countries. Moscow has echoed Vučić's words, reportedly warning him that the West is preparing for a coup. The protesters fear the mine's operation would pollute nearby groundwaters. Lithium is a key resource necessary for the manufacturing of batteries. Demand for these has risen with the push for transition to electric cars. This lithium mine could potentially supply 90% of Europe's lithium needs.
In recent days, Belarus has deployed a significant part of its armed forces to the border with Ukraine. Now, Alexander Lukashenko claims Kyiv is misinterpreting his actions.
In a TV interview, Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko announced that significant Belarusian forces had been deployed to the Ukrainian border in response to a similar buildup of Ukrainian forces. He also said that the deployment of over 100,000 Ukrainian soldiers to the border with Belarus was likely caused by Kyiv misinterpreting the movement of Russian troops into Belarus. Lukashenko claims they arrived in his country for the July 3rd Independence Day celebrations. Speculations about the possible entry of Belarus into Russia's war against Ukraine has been seen since before February 2022. Belarusian armed forces are weaker now than then, having transferred some of its heavy equipment to Russia. Ukraine keeps significant forces along the border with Belarus, although those tend to be second-rate territorial defense troops.
Vladimir Putin is conducting a visit to Baku, where he is set to discuss the settlement between Azerbaijan and Armenia. Russian influence over both countries has declined over the recent years.
Azerbaijani President Ilham Aliyev is hosting Vladimir Putin for talks on the settlement with Armenia. Baku is seeking to normalize its relations with Yerevan following its reconquest of Armenia-backed breakaway state in Nagorno-Karabakh. The deal has proven unpopular in Armenia as it includes transferring of some disputed areas to Azerbaijan. Baku has managed to take over the entire territory of the breakaway state despite the presence of Russian peacekeepers. Being preoccupied with the war in Ukraine, Moscow was unwilling to get involved in another conflict. This in turn has strained its relations with Armenia, which has since declared its intention to leave the Russian-led CSTO alliance and sought closer ties with Western countries.
And that's all on this episode of Eastern Express. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TPP World.